China is America's biggest rival, its number one opponent.
Supporting Taiwan and raising human rights issues in China's Xinjiang province.
Repeatedly yelled publicly, Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus.
The US is heavily involved in the Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas conflict.
But Trump wants to reduce conflicts. As a businessman, he understands that war is bad for business.
Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea to form an alliance.
Both have unique personalities and ways of thinking. So whom would China prefer?
Would Trump completely overlook China? Would China be able to do whatever it wants without any hindrance?
The whole world is currently waiting for the results of the US election. All eyes are fixed on who will win, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. People are divided. Some want Trump to win, while others support Harris. However, in this video, we'll explore who China might prefer and who'd be better for China as the US president, Trump or Harris. Obviously, their policies and approaches differ. Both have unique personalities and ways of thinking. So whom would China prefer? See, China hasn't openly expressed a preference for either candidate. In China's view, both candidates have their own advantages and disadvantages.
First, if we talk about Donald Trump, his stance towards China is likely to remain the same if he wins, as it was during his presidency from 2016 to 2020. If you remember, Trump adopted a very tough stance towards China during his time in office. Relations between the US and China deteriorated significantly under his administration, leading to a trade war. The Trump administration imposed various tariffs on Chinese goods, adopting a confrontational approach toward China. This stance hasn't changed much since. Even now, if you listen to Trump's speeches, he emphasizes that China does not respect intellectual property rights, engages in unfair trade practices, and takes actions that harm America's interests.
You must be aware of Trump's America First and Make America Great Again slogans. These slogans reflect Trump's approach, showing his focus on domestic issues. Many analysts interpret this to mean that, under his leadership, America may prioritize its own issues over global concerns. In other words, there is a possibility that Trump would address domestic problems by reducing American involvement worldwide. This shift in America's global engagement could benefit China. For China's interests and ambitions in the Asia-Pacific, less US interference would be ideal. While it's unlikely the US would withdraw completely, the less it interferes, the better it is for China.
So, if Trump comes back and reduces US global interference, it could be a positive development for China. But a question also arises. Would Trump completely overlook China? Would China be able to do whatever it wants without any hindrance? Could it freely expand its influence in the Asia-Pacific, the South China Sea, and other regions? No, this is unlikely to happen. If you watch Trump's latest interviews and statements, he has openly said that he wants to break the alliance between China and Russia. He has alleged that the current US administration allowed countries like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea to form an alliance, bringing these countries closer together and failing to prevent this axis from forming. That's why Trump believes that if he returns to office, he will dismantle this axis, something he argues the Biden administration failed to do.
So if Trump comes to power, he'll try to distance Russia from China, as the two together could pose a significant threat to American interests. Trump has repeatedly said he wants to end all wars, believing that American taxpayers' money should not be used to fund other nations' conflicts. With Trump's return, NATO could also weaken, since increased conflicts lead to heightened tensions, which in turn boosts NATO's influence and funding. But Trump wants to reduce conflicts. As a businessman, he understands that war is bad for business. When there is war, the economy, trade, and investment suffer. Markets become unstable. Supply chains are disrupted. Costs go up and uncertainty rises. None of this is good for business, and Trump recognizes that, which is why he supports ending wars.
Right now, the US is heavily involved in the Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas conflict. It is deeply entangled in both. If these wars end, the US would be free to shift its focus toward China, putting its entire attention on containing China. So, as long as these conflicts continue, China has the advantage that the US focus won't be on China. Additionally, Russia's dependence on China is increasing. Since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia has become highly reliant on China, significantly boosting China's influence over Russia. If Trump comes to power, there may be an opportunity for dialogue with Russia, and we could even see US-Russia relations improve, a situation unlikely under the Biden or Harris administrations. This could lead to an end to the war, a reduction in sanctions on Russia, and a decrease in Russia's dependence on China. All of this would go against China's geopolitical interests.
See, no matter how many issues China had with Trump, one thing they appreciated was the lack of unpredictability in his approach towards China. Whatever Trump did, he did openly. You might remember how he repeatedly yelled publicly, "Chinese virus" or the Wuhan virus. He didn't hold back. He openly criticized China without hesitation. There was no ambiguity in his stance. In contrast, this hasn't been the case with the Biden administration. Here, the approach has often seemed ambiguous and inconsistent. So with Trump in office, China knows he will take a harsh stance on issues like trade, but at least he's predictable. Trump follows a clear, transactional approach, which makes it easier for China to deal with him.
Whereas, if Kamala Harris comes to power, she is likely to continue the policies of the Biden administration, increasing support to Ukraine, isolating Russia, strengthening NATO, reinforcing alliances in the Indo-Pacific, supporting Taiwan, and raising human rights issues in China's Xinjiang province, among others. While Harris may not take as aggressive a stance on trade as Trump, she could adopt a tougher approach on human rights and security issues. We may see a coordinated US strategy to counter China. To contain China's rise, challenge its technological development, and limit its military expansion, the US will likely focus on building a united front, forming alliances with like-minded nations and countering China's global ambitions, which would pose significant challenges for China.
So China will not have a preference. Both options will prove challenging for China. However, if China had to choose the lesser of the two difficulties, it might find it relatively easier to deal with Trump. Ultimately, whichever of the two comes into power, Trump or Harris, will be a challenge for China. For the US right now, China is a core policy focus. So whether the Republicans or the Democrats win, relations between the US and China are unlikely to improve. China is America's biggest rival, its number one opponent. Therefore, regardless of who wins, US-China relations are likely to remain tense. The geopolitical rivalry between the US and China is today's reality, and the distrust and competition between the two countries won't end suddenly. Both nations will continue to counter each other's economic, technological, and geopolitical interests.
China is increasingly challenging the global dominance of the US. It is expanding its influence in regions such as Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. China's assertiveness in the South China Sea and its aggressive stance toward Taiwan goes against American interests. In response, the US is building alliances to counter China's expansionist agenda and focusing on increasing its military and economic influence. Due to this competition, there is a greater chance of conflict rather than cooperation between the two countries. While there may be differences in tone or approach depending on who wins the US election, Harris could adopt a softer tone on some policies, or Trump might ease up on others. Overall, we are unlikely to see any significant improvement in trust or alignment between the US and China.